Bishop Bambera, Father Quinn, Father Komonchak, guests, and members of the university community, it's an honor to welcome you to our campus. I am Bridget Frein, and I have the great privilege of chairing the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. And I want to welcome you to our conference, Word, Church, and World, Vatican II, 50 Years On. First of all, I want to express my gratitude to my colleagues who have worked so hard to put this conference on. Marianne Foley, Cyrus Olson, Michael Azar, Michael Bellafiore, Christian Crocus. It's truly gratifying to see how this has come together so beautifully. And my only role in organizing this was to say, when they suggested a conference, what a good idea. And then these five took it over. So now I give you the Reverend Kevin P. Quinn of the Society of Jesus, President of the University. Father Quinn.
Thank you, Bridget. Good evening, and thank you one and all for being here as we begin this very important conference. While an event that occurred 50 years ago headlines this conference, its real focus is on how Vatican II continues to impact the lives of Catholics and others in Northeast Pennsylvania today in 2015. During 4 years in session, Vatican II held television audiences wrapped with its elegance, magnificently choreographed public ceremonies, while more importantly, its debates generated front-page news on a near-weekly basis. By virtue of any assessment, it was the most important religious event of the 20th century, with repercussions that reach far beyond the Catholic Church. On its 50th anniversary, many theologians and others are asking, what really happened at Vatican II? And their disagreement may surprise many. Theological Studies recently dedicated more than 25 articles over 7 issues attempting to answer this question. And it began its investigation with Jesuit John O'Malley writing on the Hermeneutic of Reform. I must say, whenever that word hermeneutic is used, one should either anticipate a deep dive or simply run away. I have to say this evening, I don't intend to run away, but I look forward to our keynote this evening and for the conference tomorrow. It is my prayer as president of the University of Scranton that the spirit of Vatican II continue to flourish here on campus and in the community of Northeastern Pennsylvania. As a Jesuit and Catholic university, we aspire to provide a transformational educational experience for our students so that they become men and women of adult faith in service to their communities. With that said, and enough said, I am honored to introduce our next speaker who will offer the invocation this evening. The university is proud of our relationship with the diocese and blessed to count the Most Reverend William O'Hara, the first Bishop of Scranton, as our founder. Over 125 years later, we are still living his dream by educating young people in the Catholic tradition here in the Lackawanna Valley. Bishop O'Hara's latest successor is the Most Reverend Joseph C. Bambera. On February 23, 2010, Pope Benedict XVI appointed Bishop Joseph C. Bambera as the 10th Bishop of Scranton. a native of Carbondale, and I now know where that is, and a former member of the university's Board of Trustees, Bishop Barbera has served the Diocese of Scranton in many capacities throughout his life. He has been a great friend to the university, and we are all grateful for his leadership for our beloved diocese. My friends, please join me in welcoming our great friend of the university, the Most Reverend Joseph C. Barbera, Bishop of Scranton. Bishop.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Father Quinn, and it is always a privilege for me to be here at the University of Scranton, a place at which I feel very much at home. And as we speak about whether or not the spirit and the whole heart and soul and substance of the Second Vatican Council is alive and well in northeastern Pennsylvania, I would like to say that I think it is. I think it is. And with that, let us pray. I'd like to share with you a prayer that I suspect many of you are very familiar with. It was used at the opening of each session of the Second Vatican Council. It remains very fresh and relevant today just as much as it did 50 years ago. Let us pray. We stand before you, Holy Spirit, conscious of our sinfulness, but aware that we gather in your name. Come to us, remain with us, and enlighten our hearts. Give us light and strength to know your will, to make it our own, and to live it in our lives. Guide us by your wisdom, support us by your power, for you are God, sharing the glory of Father and Son. You desire justice for all. Enable us to uphold the rights of others. Do not allow us to be misled by ignorance or corrupted by fear or favor. Unite us to yourself in the bond of love and keep us faithful to all that is true. As we gather in your name, may we temper justice with love, so that all our discussions and reflections may be pleasing to you and earn the reward promised to good and faithful servants. We ask this of you who live and reign with the Father and the Son, one God forever and ever. Amen.
It's a great honor to welcome Father Joseph Komonchak to the University of Scranton. Father Komonchak is a priest of the Archdiocese of New York, and during the Second Vatican Council from 1960 to 1964, Father Komonchak studied at the North American College and at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. His academic career has included posts at the College of New Rochelle and St. Joseph Seminary in Yonkers. And in 1977, he joined the faculty of the Department of Religion and Religious Education at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., where he currently holds the title of Professor Emeritus. Father Komonchak's contributions to recent Catholic theology are too numerous to begin to mention, but as a New Testament scholar, I want to thank him for one that is often overlooked. In the introduction to his masterful study of the historical Jesus, a marginal Jew, John P. Meyer, a colleague of Father Komonchak's at Catholic University in the 1980s, credits him with pointing out that, quote, there was at the present time a real lacuna in solid presentations of the historical Jesus aimed at both doctoral level students and more general audiences. Thanks to Father Komonchak's encouragement, Meyer overcame his hesitation about attempting such a project and began writing what was to be a book-length treatment of the historical Jesus. And that book was followed by a second volume, and then a third volume, and then a fourth volume, and then a fifth volume will be published in November. Thank you for making sure that we biblical scholars will never run out of anything to read. More than any other scholar in the U.S., Father Komonchak has dedicated his talents to telling the story of the Second Vatican Council and reflecting on its theological significance. Besides hundreds of articles he has published in journals such as Concilium, the Journal of Religion, the Review of Politics, Theological Studies, and the Thomist, he has also edited the 5-volume History of Vatican II and authored a book called Foundations of Ecclesiology. Tonight, he will reflect on the Second Vatican Council as event. It is my pleasure now to present Father Joseph Komonchak.
I don't know if it's an apology that's in order, but when I said that to John Meyer, I was thinking of maybe a 350-page book, okay? I think the total pages now are somewhere over 3,000. As it was commented on, I had the good privilege of being in Rome from 1960 to 64, which meant that I was there for the 2 years of the preparation of the council and for the first 2 sessions held in the fall of 62 and 63. And then in 1964, I came home and became a parish priest. I want to begin with a question of what is meant by Vatican II. Perhaps we can all agree on the following description. The Second Vatican Council was a gathering of the world's Catholic bishops convoked by Pope John XXIII and led by him and his successor, Paul VI, which, after 2 years of preparation, met in 4 sessions between October 11th, 1962 and December 8th, 1965, and issued 16 documents on the Roman Catholic Church and on its role in the world. The Council sought to achieve the 3 purposes that Pope John had set for it: an inner spiritual renewal of the Church, an updating, aggiornamento, of its pastoral attitudes, behavior, and institutions, and the promotion of unity among Christians. The Council was accompanied and followed in a remarkably short time by significant changes in the Church's internal life and in its relationship with the world. We can all agree upon that, and so I presume there is no one here who, when asked what was Vatican II, will give me the reply that I once heard, that a nun told me that she once heard after asking that question in a high school in Ireland. "Come, girls," she said, "everyone knows what Vatican II is. What's Vatican II?" And a hesitant hand went up, and the young woman said, "Is that the Pope's summer residence?" So we agree on that general description. After that, things get complicated. And debates arise as to the character and significance of the council and its aftermath. In these debates, it's not always clear that people mean the same thing when they use the phrase Vatican II. For some, the essential referent of the term should be the 16 final documents which can be found set out in black print on white paper in a fairly small book, These are the permanent record of what the Council determined to say and a criterion by which to evaluate what happened after it. For others, however, Vatican II refers to the series of occurrences that took place between January 25th, 1959, when Pope John XXII announced that he intended to convoke a council, and December 8th, 1965, when Pope Paul VI brought it to a solemn close. This second meaning may be enlarged to include not only what the protagonists were doing in Rome, but also what was occurring in the larger church, as it observed more or less closely what was happening here. And as was pointed out, the council was itself an object of a great deal of attention and interest in the secular media as well. In fact, most Catholics learned what they did learn about what was happening in Rome from the secular media. For many people, it's those occurrences between those two dates that constitute the event of the council, which they regard as more, something richer, even something other than what was expressed in the final conciliar texts, a view which also was held by the young Joseph Ratzinger. I would prefer myself to speak of these occurrences between those two dates as the experience of the council, that is, the experience that was the council, and I would prefer to use the word event for a third way of seeing the council. This third way of seeing the council places what happened against the broad background of the history of the Catholic Church. At the time of the council, some people spoke of the end of historical periods of greater or lesser extent. So we heard that it was the end of the Counter-Reformation, the end of the Tridentine Church, the end of the Middle Ages, the end of the Constantinian era, and even people were speaking of it, as in the prayer of Pope John for the council, as a new Pentecost. Well, you can't go much further back than the new Pentecost, okay? All of those descriptions implied that something important was happening, something historic, something was ending, and something new and different was beginning. Even before the council closed, of course, some of the reforms it had proposed or mandated in the everyday life of the Catholic Church began to go into effect, particularly in the area of liturgical practice. These and other authorized changes were accompanied by many other changes, many of them not authorized, in almost all areas of church life and in the relationships between Catholics and many others, non-Catholic Christians, Jews, other theists, agnostics, atheists, etc. All of these changes, some people also bundle under the term Vatican II. And I suppose, therefore, this might be considered a fourth meaning of the phrase. You hear it when people speak of certain changes as occurring in the spirit of Vatican II, even when the council itself had said or decided nothing about them. As, for example, just to use liturgical examples, Mass facing the people, the vernacular throughout the Mass, communion in the hands, face-to-face confession, etc. And so people will say, well, that's Vatican II. And if you ask people what was the most obvious one about what change in the church's worship Vatican II was responsible for, the first one they will mention probably is English, and the second one will be Mass facing the people. Okay. Neither of which was mandated by the council. And never mind much larger ways of interpreting the phrase, the spirit of Vatican II. It's often made to cover a whole variety of things, and sometimes it's left so vague that I was inclined one time to suggest that the spirit of Vatican II for some people means what Vatican II would have done if no conservatives had been there. Or even worse, if I had been in charge. In other words, the council's aftermath has come to be included within the term, as in the judgment of historians that the council was the most important religious event since the Protestant Reformation, and that the Catholic Church changed more in the 10 years after Vatican II than it had in the previous 100. If as an event is an occurrence that does not leave things as they are, then it would appear certainly that we can count Vatican II as an event. We have then these reference of the term, the first three I mentioned: text, experience, and historic event. What are the relationships among them? Those who focus on the experience of the council do not want its significance reduced to that of its final texts. Something went on that was only imperfectly and inadequately expressed in the 16 documents. In response, others insist that the texts are what have authority. After all, the history that occurred between 1962 and 1965 was a process that resulted in texts. Its drama was a contest about what the council should say to the rest of the church and to the world in those texts. Those who raise the question of the event character of the council do not want it to be reduced to the experience, what happened between those dates, what the bishops and the popes intended, because whether or not an occurrence or a group of occurrences like those that took place there constitute an historic event cannot be determined by appeal simply to the intentions and experiences of the protagonists, but must include as well the aftermath of the council, what the Germans call its Wirkungsgeschichte, the history of its enucleation, its effects. Now I turn to three interpretations of the council. Considering the question of the council's historic significance, one finds three general interpretations competing with one another, and I've labeled them the progressive, the traditionalist, and the reformist. The first two, the progressive and traditionalist, draw a sharp contrast between the church as it was before Vatican II and the church as it was after it. Progressives tend to speak disparagingly of the preconciliar church and praise the council for its long overdue option for significant renewal and reform and for long needed accommodations to the modern world. If confusion followed the council, it was to be attributed to the conservative elements who remained in power in the Vatican after the bishops went home. Traditionalists reverse the polarities. They tend to praise the preconciliar church, not only its liturgical and devotional practices, but also and especially its resolute opposition to the principles and developments that resulted in the modern secularized society and culture that we know. They blame the council itself for decisions that had the effect of dissolving the tight Catholic subculture and of leading the church to capitulate to the modernity that it had rightly opposed ever since it displayed its satanic character in the French Revolution. I've often said Archbishop Lefebvre not only wanted to reverse the Second Vatican Council, he wanted to reverse the French Revolution. Against both of those groups, the reformists downplay the elements of discontinuity that the other two accentuate. As the final texts indicate, they say, the popes and the bishops did not intend revolutionary breaks in the church's life, but rather reform and renewal in the light of and continuous with its broad and deep tradition. This, they said, is the spirit, the true spirit of Vatican II. And you find it in the text. And it is not one that focuses on breaks, ruptures, discontinuities, as both progressive and traditionalist interpretations do. For 25 years, the chief representative of the reformist interpretation was Joseph Ratzinger, as a private theologian, as the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and then as Pope Benedict XVI. Position he set out in his famous interview in 1984, he set out again as Pope in his speech to the Roman Curia on December 22nd, 2005. In fact, already right after the close of the council, he had warned against, quotes, the tendency to pick everything in black and white. to which a positive summary of the council almost inevitably leads when the council's progress, steps forward, are highlighted by contrasting the new gains with the much less satisfactory state of affairs prior to the council, close quotes. He remarks at the end of his book, if you want to see what the young Joseph Ratzinger thought was happening at the council, you can look at his book called Theological Highlights of Vatican II. It's been reprinted. And there, at the very end of his comments on the fourth session of the council, he says, the favorite text that people are in the pews are hearing now, as the new changes were taking place in 1965, 66, 67, said the favorite biblical text is, you have heard that it was said of old, but I say to you. Okay. You used to say the rosary, I say you don't have to say the rosary, etc. A whole bunch of things. To this tendency to contrast so strongly before and after the council, the Pope in 2005, Pope Benedict, gave the name the Hermeneutics of Discontinuity or of Rupture. And I know people want to sprint away when they hear the word hermeneutics. It simply means ways of interpreting the council. This tends to split the pre-conciliar from the post-conciliar church to emphasize what is novel in the conciliar church and in the conciliar text, which it regards as compromised texts that, as such, do not represent the true spirit of the council. And people in this view, following this way of interpreting the council, may even regard the council as a kind of constitutional convention that offered a new constitution for the church. To this way of understanding Vatican II, Pope Benedict opposed a hermeneutic of reform. And it's important to keep that phrase in mind. He did not contrast to a hermeneutic of discontinuity a hermeneutic of continuity, but a hermeneutic of reform. And he devoted by far the larger part of that famous speech to explaining and illustrating the need for the council to rethink the church's relationship to the modern world. His argument recalled criticism of the preconciliar church that he had made himself right after the council. The church, he said, was alienated from the modern world as a result of a series of developments and bitter oppositions. A document like the Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom, Dignitatis Humanae, corrected earlier decisions and attitudes and gave a fundamental yes to the modern world, even while it at the same time was recovering the deepest patrimony of the church and preserving and deepening her inmost nature and true identity. It was, the Pope said, precisely in this combination of continuity and discontinuity at different levels that the very nature of true reform consists. It's unfortunate, then, that Pope Benedict's position is often oversimplified as a hermeneutics of continuity, since continuity points to only one element in his analysis. His view is a good deal more balanced than those of many who claim this speech as their inspiration. In fact, of course, it would be hard to find any serious theologian or historian who would maintain that Vatican II was marked exclusively by continuity or exclusively by discontinuity. Everyone speaks of continuity and discontinuity at different levels, which is the Pope's definition of what a hermeneutics of reform pursues. Okay, what was the event? Well, I find in the literature that there are two ways in which the event character of the church is being described. When the last two popes, Pope John Paul II and Benedict, spoke of Vatican II as a great spiritual event, the most important spiritual event of the 20th century, they were speaking of its impact first and chiefly upon the Catholic Church itself, and they were doing so in theological terms. Perhaps the most famous theological interpretation of Vatican II is the one proposed by Karl Rahner. His thesis was that the Second Vatican Council is the beginning of a tentative approach by the Church to the discovery and official realization of itself as a world church. eine Weltkirche, a global church. Rahner divided all of church history, all 2,000 years of it, into three great epochs. The age of Jewish Christianity, which ended fairly soon. The age of Hellenistic European Christianity. And the epoch that was now opening in the middle of the 20th century, the age of the global church. St. Paul was the initiator and the great defender of the shift from the first, the Judeo-Christianity, to the second age, that of Hellenism. And he provided a vigorous theological argument for the caesura, the break that the bringing of the gospel to non-Jewish nations entailed. And you can read in St. Paul's epistles the difficulty of this moment. And it was recognized to what a degree Christianity, very early, represented, for all of its roots in Judaic history and Judaic experience, represented a break. The Lord was replacing the law as the center. Something as crucial to Jewish self-identification, self-identity as circumcision could be dispensed with. The ritual laws could be dispensed with. A tremendous break. And Rahner was suggesting in this essay that for the church to shift from a Eurocentric church to a church that is at home with and must adapt itself to other great cultures is a shift that is as significant as that first one and may be as difficult to comprehend or to, in a sense, manage or control from the beginning. Now, Rahner insisted in this essay, something that's not often pointed out, that was a tentative essay, and he said his considerations were preliminary, rudimentary, vague, unsystematic, and unclear. Adjectives with which I agree. This has not prevented it from gaining a great deal of attention and approval. What I have found in theological interpretations of the Council is that they tend, in my view, to be too theological, too spiritual. So you will find people writing essays on the experience of God at the Council. And I'm not denying that there was an experience of God at the Council. But I do have, being a nominalist, I suppose, I do have some difficulty of speaking about 2,500 bishops gathered together as having a single experience of God. Okay. I suspect that Cardinal Ottaviani's experience of God was different from Cardinal Bea's. So I have some problem there. But what strikes me is how little interest they show, people who are interested in the theological interpretation, how little interest or even awareness they have of how the term event is used by historians and sociologists. That is, in terms of breaks with routine or ruptures or discontinuities. In almost all of the literature, among the historians or the sociologists, one feature regularly appears, which is that an event represents novelty, discontinuity, a rupture, a break from routine that causes surprise, disturbance, and even trauma, and perhaps initiates a new routine, a new realm of the taken for granted. As one scholar put it, an event is a dynamic phenomenon or situation that is detached in one way or another from the whole set of repetitions and regularities that constitute the course of daily life. A dynamic situation or phenomenon detached in one way or another from the whole set of repetitions and routines and regularities that constitute the course of daily life. An event, one of them says, is difference. Now, those of you who are old enough to go back and to remember what happened during the council or in the years after the council, and I can see many of you can't go back that far, I want to tell you that among the things that were happening in the church was a departure from the whole set of repetitions and routines and regularities that constituted the course of everyday Catholic life. William H. Sewell, who was a historian and also a historical sociologist, has worked out a theory of events that has clear affinities with developments among historians. He conceives of events as, quotes, sequences of occurrences that result in transformations of structures. Sequences of occurrences that result in transformations of structures. And by structure here, don't reify it, don't think of something objective there. A structure could be habitual culture. It could mean simply, again, those repetitions and regularities, the things that we take for granted in our everyday life. That's a structure. But an event is a sequence of occurrences that result in transformations of structures. Such a sequence, he suggests, begins with a rupture of some kind, which produces reinforcing ruptures in other locations. These ruptures spiral into transformative historical events when a sequence of interrelated ruptures disarticulates the previous structural network, makes repair difficult, you can't go back, and makes a novel rearticulation possible. And Sewell illustrated his theory by a consideration of how the event at the Bastille on July 14, 1789, was transformed into that permanent change known as the French Revolution. And on Sewell's theory and this illustration, Andrew Greeley drew to argue that Vatican II represents another example of an event. And one could devote a whole paper to trying to say, all right, what was the first rupture of some kind that the Council represented? What were other ruptures that occurred because that first one had occurred? Can you identify a sequence of interrelated ruptures that all resulted in the disarticulation of a previous taken-for-granted structure? I was moved to discuss this in some respects because I was born in 1939, so I grew up as a Catholic in the 40s and 50s. And then I entered the seminary early, and so in the late 50s through the early 60s, I was introduced into all kinds of movements of spiritual and theological renewal that were taking place. But about 5 years after the council ended, I remember watching my nieces and nephews, who were then young, and suddenly realizing that they were growing up in a different Catholic church than the one I had grown up in. Yes, there was continuity, I'm not denying that. But in terms of devotions, in terms of habitual practices, and attitudes or relationships with non-Catholics, any number of these things, they were growing up Catholic differently than I had grown up Catholic. And so I began to wonder what had happened that accounted for that difference, and that in part led me to my thesis. But on the view that William Sewell is suggesting, it's not enough to reconstruct the experience of the protagonists at the council and to think that you have thereby fulfilled the historian's role. The historian's Vatican II is not that of the participants of Vatican II. The historian's Vatican II is not that of the protagonists of Vatican II. One can only identify an event by placing it within a series defined by a plot. Applied to our subject, this raises the question, into what series should we place the Second Vatican Council? How far back does that series go in order to make Vatican II intelligible? And since we're now talking about this 50 years after the Council, must not a consideration of the Council and what it was historically also take into account that 50 years have passed since the council ended. So that what took place between 59 when the Pope announced the council and 65 when it closed, all of that vast series of individual occurrences that took place there was a prehistory to the church that helps to define the dynamics of what's taking place then. And we have 50 years of seeing what the aftermath of those 6 or 7 years has been. Pope Benedict tended to deny the event character and wanted to insist on the continuity. And I've already indicated that my difficulties with that position. But now let me turn to the question, what was the break, the departure from what had been? Sewell is very good also at pointing out that if you're going to do a study of a significant event like the French Revolution or what happened in the Catholic Church during and after Vatican II, you have to be able to talk about what things were like before, to do at least some type of portrait of what was it like to be a Catholic before Vatican II. And I used to assign my students at Catholic U, the undergraduates, task of interviewing a Catholic who was old enough to remember life before Vatican II. And I gave them a whole set of questions that they had to ask, because I didn't want them just to go in and chat. And it required the person to identify what it really felt like, what it meant, etc., and also to say what things from the present perspective they liked about it, they might miss, what things they didn't like and don't miss, etc. And then, do they remember anything about Vatican II? And then, what about the church today? Are there things that they like and other things that they don't like? And it was very useful. It was the most successful assignment I ever made as a teacher in 45 years of teaching. So, what was the before? Here are some of the descriptions of what the form of Catholicism was from which the council is thought to have departed. The great French historian Jean Delumeau makes it a post-Reformation construction. He's of the view that what we call Catholicism is a post-Reformation construction. And it turns out that if you do a history of the term Catholicism, both in French, either in French or in English, you'll find that it's a word that was introduced only in the 18th century. It's not a traditional way. Okay. So, Catholicism was a social form in which the Catholic Church, which certainly had existed before in other forms, existed from the time of the Protestant Reformation. Father Congar, following Giuseppe Alberigo, refers to Tridentinism, or I suppose in English we might say Trentism. Tridentine is the adjective for the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent was the great reforming council of the 16th century, and its consequences created the church in which those old enough to remember grew up. And Tridentinism, Congar described as a system that embraced absolutely everything. Theology, ethics, Christian behavior, religious practice, liturgy, organization, Roman centralization, the constant intervention of Roman congregations in the life of the church. Within the post-Tridentine era, I have proposed that a distinctively modern Roman Catholicism was constructed in the 19th century, in opposition to new and even revolutionary economic, social, political, and cultural developments. The revolutionary era that threw Europe into chaos lasted from 1789 at least until 1815, where the Congress of Vienna ended the Napoleonic era. And now there seemed to be calm all over Europe, at least it wasn't at war anymore, and the church could try to pick up the pieces. But the church, as it tried to reconstruct itself after the chaos of those years, chaos and confusions and losses of those years, was now doing so in a different world than the world that had existed before the French Revolution. And as the 19th century and 20th centuries went on, there were new industrial, economic, social, political, philosophical transformations that were taking place. And it was in this period that the church gave itself a new social form, which I call modern Roman Catholicism. Anti-modern in its ideology, if you want, very modern in its organization, especially in the increasing centralization upon Rome. I find a certain confirmation of this in what Joseph Ratzinger once criticized as that little Catholic Sonderwelt, that little Catholic world off by itself. You know, you have Catholic schools, so you have the kids from kindergarten through college. You have Catholic youth organizations so that they won't go to the YMCA. You have Catholic poet societies. You have Catholic business societies, etc. The hundreds and hundreds of Catholic organizations in order to confirm our Catholic identity and to make sure you weren't corrupted by all those other organizations out there. A little Catholic world apart. Ratzinger was very critical of this, that it represented a narrowing down of what Catholic Christianity ought to be. He spoke of the church before the council as being in the late phases of a culture that doesn't look forward, but looks backwards. And theology, just to take his own area of specialization, theology seems to have thought its way through everything. Piety has practiced and crystallized everything that could possibly be done and formulated. Every space has been filled up with the data of tradition, just like a church building that is packed with altars, pictures, testimonies to the piety of former generations. Remember the old churches? You know, you had statues for practically everybody. The textbook that we were given when I was studying in Rome in moral theology was called A Compendium of All Moral Theology. It was in 2 volumes. The first volume was 750 pages long, and the second one was 850. This is the compendium. You'd hate to see what it might look like if they gave it to us all. It was written, of course, for seminarians who were going to become priests, and it tried to anticipate every conceivable question that might come up in the confessional, some of which you might think would never come up. Anyway, so that tight Catholic subculture, sub-society that people of my age grew up with was, we drank it in with our mother's milk. This is what it meant to be a Catholic, and it affected practically everything that we did. But Father Congar also placed the council in a broader context, a world that, and he said, we're living in a world that no longer understands itself in terms of a metaphysics of fixed and hierarchically ordered natures. The world has been historicized. It's now what is meant by the world now is what human beings have made in the past, are making now, and will make in the future. Humanity, he said, has taken charge of itself. The world is now history, and man is the subject of the process by which he constructs himself. That was a basic cultural phenomenon that defined modernity for Father Congar. Bernard Lonergan, who was my main mentor, used almost the same phrase as Congar. He spoke about a massive breakthrough that had been effected at Vatican II, the Church's disengagement from the forms of classical culture and a transposition into the forms of modern culture. By classicist culture, Lonergan meant a notion developed in the early modern era that was content with the universal and the abstract in its treatment of individual and collective human life. But beginning with the scientific revolution, and Lateran is the only one of the historians or the theologians who takes into account the transformation of human life that has been the effect of the scientific and technological revolution. Almost everyone else is content to talk about the cultural issues. Beginning with the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the rise of historical consciousness, the development of the human sciences, and the economic, social, political, and cultural revolutions of the last 2 centuries, Westerners have made use of and made dominant a modern notion of culture that is impatient with the abstract and the universal, glories in the particular and concrete, and makes few, if any, normative claims. And if you want to see this clash between classicist culture and modern historical culture in the sense that he has just defined, all you have to do now is to look at the definition of families and the definition of genders. That there is a clash now between judgments that are considered to be universal and absolute and unchanging on the one hand, the definition of the family, or the definition of what it means to be a man or a woman and the relationships between the sexes, and now a view of marriage as a human construct. Yes, it was that for millennia, but we made it what it was. We can make it something else. And the same thing with regard to gender relations. Most distinctively, Lonergan argued, modern consciousness is self-aware. Modern culture is the culture that knows about itself and other cultures. It is aware that they are man-made. So it is that modern man not only individually is responsible for the life he leads, but also collectively is responsible for the world in which he lives it. In an essay that he first delivered at a symposium on the theological implications of the council, Lonergan spoke of revelation, divine revelation, as God's entry into man's making of man. You have to excuse the language. He might not say it that way today, but it's also it's a neat phrase, man's making of man, and I don't know how to put it in other language. The basic context in which to think of divine revelation, our redemption in Christ, is to say that God has entered into our history. He is now part of the process by which the human race is making itself what it is. God's entry into man's making of man. I think that this is one of the most important constituents of the cultural context in which Vatican II met, but it does not receive an awful lot of attention. I think the Council emphasized this, especially in the first section of Gaudium et Spes, devoted to human activity in the world, numbers 33 to 39, which deny that human activity should be counterposed to divine sovereignty. And it vindicates a legitimate autonomy of earthly activities. In the next chapter, numbers 40 to 45, the Council explains not only what the Church can offer to individuals and societies today, but also what it can learn from them. But perhaps clearest is the next chapter, which is on culture, particularly its description of the factors that have produced the modern world and its distinctive culture in paragraph 54, and the chief characteristic of this culture, which is described in number 55. In every group or nation, I'm quoting now from Gaudium et Spes 55, in every group or nation, an ever-increasing number of people are becoming aware that they themselves are the artisans and originators of the culture of their community. Throughout the world, a sense of both autonomy and of responsibility is constantly growing that is of the greatest importance for the spiritual and moral maturity of the human race. We are witnessing the birth of a new humanism, one in which Man is defined first of all by his responsibility toward his brothers and sisters and toward history. A new humanism in which we are defined first of all by our responsibility toward one another and toward history. In other words, toward the history that we are making, which is very clear today. One of the great challenges of how we are exercising our collective responsibility for what mankind will become is the ecological crisis. We are determining today how human life will be lived in the future. We, today, a new humanism in which we are defined by our responsibility towards our brothers and sisters now living and towards history. Now, the Council, I think, in such texts as Gaudium et Spes and the Declaration on Religious Freedom, insisted upon this. And it was an important moment for Catholics to overcome their main, or to go beyond the main criticism of modernity, philosophically, theologically, politically, culturally, which was that insistence upon individual freedom, and this was almost inevitably taken to be a denial of God's rights. Human rights were being claimed, but what about God's rights? When I was working on an essay, I went into the Catholic University Library and found a book on liberalism. It was a history of liberalism. And the first chapter was entitled, it was in French, first chapter was entitled Satan, Satan. I said, well, this is the long view. And what was Satan's great sin? He said to God, non serviam, I will not obey, I will not serve. The second chapter was Adam and Eve, who were told, don't eat that tree. And they ate it anyway. Guess who's the hero of the third chapter? It's a bit of a leap. Martin Luther. All three of these are rejections, repudiations of God's authority. And in the course of this, the whole idea, which is a very Thomist one, and they should never have been lost to view, is that there is a legitimate sense in which we can speak of our human autonomy, of our freedom. St. Thomas has a wonderful place. He constantly quotes quotes Aristotle saying, a free person is one who is self-responsible. And Aquinas remembers that when he's interpreting the passage in 2 Corinthians where St. Paul says, where the Spirit is, there is freedom. And he says, if a person avoids evil simply because it is forbidden, and does the good simply because God commands it, that person is not free. Why? Because he is obeying, following another, even a divine other. But if that person avoids evil because it's evil, and does the good because it's the good thing to do, that person is free. And that's what the Holy Spirit does in us, he says. It gives us an inner habit that makes us love the good and hate the evil. And so we eagerly do the good and avoid the evil. For so long, that was lost to Catholic consciousness, it seems to me. And the Council restored it. A sense of created autonomy. The two phrases go together. God made us to be autonomous, not in the sense that we don't have to obey the commandments, but in the sense God wants us to take responsibility for the persons that we become. And this, as Laningen was pointing out, not simply on the level of our individual existences, which has always been part of it. You know, you're going to go before God on Judgment Day, and he's going to say, all right, what did you make of your life? So we've always had that sense. But it's also a collective sense that we have become responsibility collectively for what the world will be like afterwards. Now, just as importantly as that, I think the Council can also be read as a particular moment in which the Catholic Church also became conscious of its responsibility for its own self-realization and eagerly accepted the challenge. The Church became conscious of its responsibility for its own self-realization and eagerly accepted the challenge, so that the Church would look at its inner life and structure and see them as God's gift, yes, but also avoid thinking that everything about that is divinely ordered and willed, and therefore take responsibility for the very difficult and delicate discernment between what should be changed and what shouldn't be changed, so that the Church, meaning all of us, takes responsibility for its own self now. So it's not only the individual person, not only the individual Christian, it's not only all Christians together, it's the Church itself which now engages in this self-reflection. Now, this does not mean that the Council should be interpreted simply as church-centered. When people, it's the technical term, is Ecclesial Centrism, and some people are very critical of it. And I say, well, for me, it all depends upon what you mean by the church. But a church that's centered upon Christ and its mission is a church which is self-conscious, but it's self-conscious of its duties before God and of its duties towards the world. And I don't have a problem with, if that's the kind of church you're going to say, for the texts to be considered ecclesiocentric. I think that at Vatican II, the Church took fuller and more conscious responsibility for itself than it ever had before. And I could show this in detail by reference to texts. But suffice it now to point out the vast range over which the Council extended its range. The liturgy. Every one of our sacramental rites was carefully examined and altered to a greater or lesser degree. Every one of them. There is not a single one of the 7 sacraments that is performed today the way it was performed in 1960. Relations between clergy and laity. Council statement reflects a transitional stage. I would say one of the dynamics still at work is negotiating the relations between clergy and laity, but they're not simply what they were. Relations between papal primacy and episcopal collegiality, often left in suspense in compromise documents. Some people have a negative towards compromise documents. But if you have 2,500 bishops together and you want to get a document out, at some point you're going to be compromising. Same thing happened at the Council of Trent. The Dominicans said this is the way we should talk about the Eucharist. The Franciscans say if you put that in the conciliar decree, you're declaring Franciscans to be heretics. So they had to take a step back and come up with a way of speaking about the Eucharistic ministry that didn't favor the Dominicans or the Franciscans. Well, it's something similar to that happened at the Council. And one of the most basic questions was the relationship between the Pope and his universal jurisdictional authority and the College of Bishops. And the Council could not solve this issue, and so it came up with compromise language, expecting that the canon lawyers and the theologians after the Council would work at this and try to clarify things. Think of the renewal of religious life, priesthood, and seminaries, the way the missions are conceived and regulated, relations between the Catholic Church and other Christians and their communities, relations with non-Christian religions, especially with Jews, important aspects of the church's relationship with the world, and in particular, religious freedom. So the doctrine, the position for which John Courtney Murray was silenced by the Holy Office in 1954-55 became official conciliar teaching 10 years later in 1965. All of this, in addition to the theological vision of the church and divine revelation that was the fruit of the theological renewal of the first half of the 20th century. Every one of these themes has to do with the way in which the church understands itself and seeks to realize its redemptive mission in the world. The council was the church taking full responsibility for itself. I'll end with a brief description of what was new at Vatican II. As I said, there's been a reaction against people who wanted to stress the new part, the part that represented a break. But I think it's natural to expect that historians and sociologists will place their emphasis on the elements of novelty and of discontinuity. We do not tend to accentuate or even to notice the familiar and the ordinary. That's why it's called taken for granted. And of course, it's hard to write a history in which nothing happens. And God knows that there was much that was not familiar and not ordinary about the Second Vatican Council. First, the very fact that it took place. Ecumenical councils are not ordinary occurrences in the life of the Church. Second, the agenda given to the Council by Pope John XXIII and Paul VI to undertake spiritual renewal and pastoral updating to heighten the Church's internal self-awareness for the sake of the mission in and for the world. Such self-reflection is not an ordinary occurrence, and by itself it can call into question the taken for granted and in that way be traumatic. Once a student came to me after she had interviewed her father about the changes in the Catholic Church. And she said, my father used a curse word in describing his reaction to the council. And I don't know whether I can use it. So I said, well, what was it? And she said, those goddamn liberals fixed what wasn't broken. And you get the point. We live our lives. Let's whoever it was that said it, an unexamined life is not worth living. Okay. How many of us examine his life, his or her life, every day? Okay. We don't. An examined life, a life you had to examine every day, would be hard to live, it seems to me. Now I can't remember why I brought that up. Oh, if you suddenly, something happens that causes you now to examine this, then everything is different. Your child goes off to first-year college and comes back having taken Psychology 101 and decides to use the Thanksgiving dinner as an occasion for her to psychoanalyze the family. If you start examining what hadn't been examined before, the taken for granted, that can cause social disruption. The pastoral goal of the council, thirdly, departed from one of the familiar goals of previous councils that were called in order to deal with some crisis or particularly with the threat of errors. Pope John XXIII made it clear in his first speech to the council that he wanted it, in opposing error, to use the medicine of mercy instead of the weapons of severity. He did not want any condemnations. Fourth, in warning the council not to listen to the prophets of doom, who see nothing in the modern world but prevarication and ruin, Pope John was proposing a new relationship between the church and the modern world, one that focused more on the opportunities than on the threats of the contemporary world. Fifth, the rejection of condemnations and the new relationship with the world was reflected, as John O'Malley has stressed, in the new style that is used by the conciliar documents. They are not written in the telegraphically brief and colorless language common in earlier councils, but in a discursive style that exhorts rather than threatens, seeks to persuade rather than to command, invites rather than repels. And finally, the 4 years during which the council met gave the church an illustration of how the supreme authority could be exercised collegially. That is, not by the Pope alone, but by the Pope along with the whole body of bishops who brought to the common conversation the faith and practices of their several churches as they sought to live the gospel in various circumstances and in face of different challenges. The council, not only in its teaching, but also in its unfolding, reinserted the Pope into the College of Bishops and exemplified the universal church as a communion of churches. On the view that I have outlined here, whether and to what a degree the Second Vatican Council should be considered an event is not something that is determined simply by considering what the popes and bishops of Vatican II intended or said or did. The important work of establishing that, and it is important, is what a detailed history of Vatican II undertakes, as in our 5-volume History of Vatican II. But I prefer to call that the reconstruction of the experience of the Council. But to speak of Vatican II as an event, to repeat, requires a larger and broader investigation, one that first places the Council against the backdrop of earlier church history, especially the history of the last 2 or 3 centuries. But it must also take into account what has happened in the 50 years since Vatican II. There are senses in which the aftermath of the Council can be judged theologically and even spiritually in the light of the final texts of the Council. So you can say, did this development, was it faithful to the text of Vatican II? It's a legitimate question. But historians seeking an overall interpretation and assessments of the Council will want to know also what was happening at and after the Council. And that's something that may not have been intended, foreseen, or desired by participants at Vatican II. In that sense, whether Vatican II was an event, and if so, what kind of an event, is still being determined. And it's being determined not only by popes and bishops, but also by all of us as Vatican II unfolds its virtualities. Think of the difference in common Catholic consciousness now when it looks back 50 years to Vatican II in the last 2 years since Pope Francis took over the papacy. He is the first pope to be ordained after Vatican II. His whole priesthood has been exercised in what the church became in Argentina and elsewhere after Vatican II. Think how the council seems once again in everybody's mind. Think of the comparisons that are made between the dramatic differences that he has made and those of Pope John the 23rd. Something like a new Pentecost is being sensed. And that, of course, is what Pope John the 23rd prayed that the council would be, a new Pentecost. Thank you.
We'll have 10 minutes for questions.
Okay.
Father Komonchak will take questions for 10 minutes.
Or not. I'm looking at this couple over here. What year were you born? And you? 1993. So it was Vatican II ancient history, right? I often... Who has a question?
An ecclesiologist that you have a lot of respect for is work that came out a couple years ago that he did with Serena Nochetti. Early on in the book that one of the main obstacles to a robust reception of the council has been that many ecclesiological issues that probably were best left in the hands of theologians have been answered by canonists since the end of the council. I don't know if you have any comments on that critique, if you think that's a fair assessment of the post-conciliar church, and if it is, sort of, what do we do about it?
Well, first that to repeat something I said, Vatican II decided not to settle some issues. For example, with regard to divine revelation. Is all of God's revelation contained somehow in the scriptures? Or are there texts that God has revealed that we know only through oral tradition? And there was a big controversy about this at the council. It was one of the most important dramatic confrontations of the first session. The council decided not to decide the issue. And basically what that represented is because the other view was going to make it clear that not everything was in the Bible. So it's been left open for further clarification. The relationship between papal primacy and episcopal collegiality is another example. It was impossible to settle really serious theological and canonical questions. And so the council, both in Lumen Gentium, the Constitution on the Church, and in the Decree on Bishops, chose language that would set out the various dimensions. Here is the Pope's authority, here's the authority of the College of Bishops, or of the individual bishop. Think about this. What I found generally happened after Vatican II, often happened after Vatican II, was that and I'm thinking now in particular of primacy collegiality, that the code chose one of the sides at the council and then chose to emphasize those passages in the council documents that stress that. Now, it was not only canonists who were doing this, there were also theologians who were doing it. And that is part of the problem. I did an article for Concilium on Vatican II in the new code. So that is one. And an area that I did investigate very closely was the authority of episcopal conferences. And at the Synod of 1985, the Synod asked that a clarification be made of the theological and juridical status of episcopal conferences. It did not intend this for Rome to appoint a committee that would do this. But Rome did appoint a committee that would do this. And it came up with a very restrictive judgment about what episcopal conferences can do and what they can't do, and claimed that this was what Vatican II was doing, and I don't think that they can legitimately claim that. Yes?
Thank you for your talk. I have a question about the notion of event that you're using in your presentation. How dependent is your proximity to the time period for defending evidence with respect to the claims you're making about the event? So do you need people who are living and then maybe documenting their lived experience around the event to be able to back up your claims about the width available as an event versus a text? So in a sense, we're moving beyond simply text as evidence and moving into something that's not simply experience, but a wider reverberating event around this historical time period. And I'm wondering how dependent that is upon observation, recording, contemporary media, and so forth. And the further we get distant from that time period and witnesses, eyewitnesses, we can still appeal to the notion of event to make our case for something like what's happening at a particular point in time. So we're left with historical, metaphysical questions about the nature of what you're claiming with respect to evidence.
Yes. active areas of investigation is in the reception of Vatican II. There have been important monographs. Gilles Routier, a very good Canadian ecclesiologist, did his dissertation on the reception of Vatican II in the Archdiocese of Quebec, and there are other things. And for that, you have to depend. You can still depend upon the memories of some people, but memories, always have to be checked, and texts and all. And it's a very diffuse thing. Thank God that the period immediately after the council was a period when people actually still continued to write documents and to write letters, and they weren't doing anything. They weren't using social media. So you do have an abundance of those things, and the tale is going to vary tremendously. So you could say, well, and not only in terms of dioceses or nations or regions, but also even in terms of parishes. There will be parishes which will say, well, we took that Vatican II thing far more seriously than that old grouch over there did, that kind of thing. The distance in time is an important thing also. I remember, Cardinal, when I was before I got involved in the international group that produced the history of Vatican II, I had been thinking of doing one myself. And I mentioned this to Cardinal Dearden of Detroit, and he said, oh, Joe, this would be in the mid-'80s. Oh, Joe, it's too soon. It's too soon. Which, of course, is the famous reply that Mao Zedong gave, supposed to have given, when he was asked, what do you think of the French Revolution? He said, it's too soon to say. Because if you think about it, the sorts of things that the French Revolution initiated are still having an impact. So, whether and to what a degree. I mean, one of the great Catholic sociologists, historians of 20th century Catholicism, the French, and Émile Poulain, said that he thought that in the long perspective, Vatican II was a blip. And that under John Paul II, and here he's not talking about internal church matters, it's more church-world relations. He said, you see the same dynamic at work, the same view at work under him that you saw under the great popes of the 19th and 20th centuries. Well, I don't agree with that, but there are people who think that. So, I mean, there were some people who thought that the pontificate of John Paul II was far more significant than the Second Vatican Council. Yes?
I was born in 55. I was the first group of altar boys in my parish in Philadelphia that did not have to learn Latin. I'm intrigued by your comment, which I've heard often, that the liberals broke or fixed what wasn't broken. One thing I think that was very difficult, a huge change, and has made the world better, or the church better, was the whole idea that the church existed to keep you out of hell. I can vividly remember asking a priest, what happened to all the people who went to hell for eating meat on Friday? My mother's generation, for many of them, the church really mattered. Because if you didn't do what the church said, something really bad would happen to you. And if you did do what the church said, something really good would happen to you. The students I teach here, if I tell them they're going to hell, they'll just say, that's your opinion, if they're that polite. If I tell them they're never going to get a job that pays more than, if their job is never going to pay more than $50,000 a year, they will tremble. I guess my question is, how do we really communicate to younger people today the value of the church and the need for the church in their lives? I have no answer to this. I see EWTN putting out a more pre-conciliar version of this. But the liberal church really were not making, I think, a really good case for the need for the church in people's lives.
Well, and that's something you did. Look at the difference Pope Francis has made in the minds of many people as an image of what the Catholic Church could be. This morning, as I was looking for something on my computer and going down through a list of files, I came upon one, something like lenient penances. And I said, what is this about? I went looking. It turns out that it is a quotation that St. Thomas Aquinas uses in his commentary on Matthew, in the Catena Aurea, from Pseudo-Chrysostom, a Latin writer of maybe the 5th, 6th, 7th century, who talks there about confessors who impose too heavy penances on people. And I read it and I said, my God, this is what Pope Francis is saying. One of the comments he makes is, how can you be severe when your master was not in his encounter with sinners? So I think you could begin by saying, all right, where is the face of the church visible? Well, it is visible in a paradigmatic figure like the Pope, and this Pope in particular. But the church has to be made significant in the lives of people locally, in the parish. It begins in the parish, seems to me. That's where people discover that's where they hear first the word about God and about Jesus Christ. And that's where it's supposed to have its first impact. And this is not an answer to your question, but it really is. I mean, you have to take the word church down from the heavens, move it from what some people mistakenly call the Roman center, and make it something that they appreciate in their own lives. And that begins right from the first sacraments and education and catechesis and all. But you're right. It was a time when we had a whole set of taken for granted institution that served to our pastoral purposes, in a sense. And many of those have disappeared. Sometimes for good, sometimes for not so good. Sorry, I can't help anymore. One more. Va bene. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Komonchak, for your insights on the event that has so shaped the church today. Father's book, Who Are the Church, will be for sale this evening and tomorrow, and he's willing to sign some copies of this evening. We also hope that you'll be able to join us for the rest of the conference tomorrow. If you need more information about tomorrow's events, or if you want to register, you can see my colleagues in the back of the theater as you exit. And for those of you who will be attending tomorrow, if you're not familiar with the campus, you should know that the talks will be held in the Loyola Science Center, room 133. That's to be distinguished from the old Loyola Hall. This is the new building, and the entrance to Loyola Science Center is on Monroe Avenue past Linden Street. So if you park in the parking pavilion, exit opposite this building, walk down Monroe past the library and St. Thomas, and you'll see the entrance on the left. And then once you enter the building, go right, and you'll come to the auditorium. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you tomorrow.